Hello, and welcome to the module. In this first session, we will explore some of the macro or large-scale background contexts of leadership and planning in educational settings, and some of the main things that have influenced theory and practice in different ways over time. Leadership is often about dealing with changing situations in an organization. Sometimes the changes the leaders are seeking to bring about will be successful and possibly very easy to achieve, and sometimes they'll be more difficult and perhaps even unsuccessful. However, it will be a very unusual situation where a leader never needs to make any changes. Now, being able to successfully achieve change in an organization requires good management and good planning and good leadership. But management, leadership and planning are not the same thing. And we'll return to this topic later on in the module, but for now, let's begin by looking at the ways making changes in organisations has been understood and practiced and thought about over the years. Many of the ideas and practices about changing things in organisations and that we see in educational settings today have originally been derived from the business world, but just like the organisations themselves, the ideas and ways of making changes have also changed over the years. And these different approaches range from very large and broad perspectives and ways of thinking about leadership and what leadership is, to approaches that are more focused on the personal and the individual. Now, I suppose unsurprisingly, ideas taken from business about leadership and what good leadership might look like tend to be driven by concerns about selling things to customers and about how to make sure that the quality of those things is appropriately good. That might seem quite a straightforward idea for a business that sells things, because the customers are the ones who pay for what the business creates. And if the customers are not happy, they can always take their business and their money somewhere else and buy what they want from some other business. These ways of thinking focus our attention on who those in charge of the business think their customers are and what these customers need or want or expect from what the business creates. The customers are an extremely important consideration for those in charge of the business because unless they continue to have customers, they won't continue to have a business. What the customer wants is therefore extremely important for any business that expects to stay in business or to grow and become more successful. Indeed, the success of most businesses is often understood as being mainly about how many customers they have and how satisfied those customers are. But do we think that schools are the same things as businesses, and so should be organised and run and led in the same way as a successful business? And even if we do believe that educational institutions should be organised and run like businesses, who are the customers? So it depends on who we think the customer for a school is. Is it the government or the state, because they pay for what the schools create? Or is it the national taxpayer who is the customer because they provide the money that the government spends on their behalf? Or is it just the parents of the children at a particular school who are that school's customers? Now, if we think that schools should be run in the same way as a successful business, then, like the people running successful businesses, the leaders of those schools will need to think about their customers, whoever they are, and what they want, or what the business thinks they want. So this will be an important thing that the business needs to pay attention to, and any changes that the business makes to the things it does or to how it does them will need to take that into account. In business, the customer is always right, and therefore customers are what we call an external force that influence the things a business does, and any changes that it makes to what it does or that it might want to make in future. External forces are things that a business cannot control, although they may be able to anticipate them. And as well as things like changing customer desires, these forces can include things such as new legislation and laws, the effects of inflation or unemployment, the cost of raw materials or the cost of employing people, their wages, changes in fashions, the growth of online alternatives, or as a result of competition from other businesses nearby, or changes in technology. Things like these are all part of the organization's external environment and are the external forces. From the perspective of leaders and planners working inside a business or other organization, these kinds of external forces on the business are important and they need to pay close attention to them. Therefore, the way businesses are organized and the way they are run on a day-to-day basis, what's sometimes called the organization's internal environment, tend to reflect the influence of these important external forces and can often be seen in the way it's organized and in its culture, as well as in its ideas about what a healthy organizational climate looks like from the individual or personal perspective of those who work in the organization. And we'll explore these ideas further later during the module. A second and equally large-scale macro context of change is related to the broad social changes that have happened in many parts of the world, especially in the West, as a result of a shift from modern societies towards what are called postmodern societies. Now, although these words might at first glance not seem to be very relevant to our topic, it's actually important for us to understand them and what they mean and what the implications of them are for our way of thinking about things like leadership and management and planning and change in educational institutions today. And that's because these words mark two important periods in history between which there occurred a significant shift in the way many people thought about the world and society in general, and about things like how they worked and how they ought to work and what were the best ways to make sense of the world around them. Following the period of the First Industrial Revolution, which was from around the late 1700s to the end of the 1800s, this period called modernism stretched from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century and was a time marked by terrifying wars. The first from the First World War, 1914 to 1918, and which H.G. Wells called the war to end all war, because many people at that time thought it would lead to the destruction of the kinds of government and attitudes that caused war. And it lasted all the way through the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. And during these modern times, many Western societies saw great changes in countries and in people's lives, and rising concerns about the old established traditional ways of behaving, working and thinking. European culture fell out of favour because it was seen as having become too corrupt, too complacent and lethargic. And many people saw it as being too frightened of change and too concerned with image and maintaining appearances, instead of dealing with the world the way it really was. So many scientists and artists and philosophers increasingly began to reject the established ways of arranging things, or what I suppose today we would call the establishment. And many of their ideas quite intentionally undermined tradition and authority in the hope that this could transform society and make it better. These new and sometimes radical ideas extended into all walks of life, including how work should be thought of and the way businesses and organisations should be led and how they should be managed. And modernist organisations were characterised by being large and quite hierarchical and fairly bureaucratic, with departmentalised ways of organising things. And you may know of many organisations today that are still like that. And they were also characterised by the cultures and work practices inside them, these organisations, which tended to be quite closed and demarcated with different sections, specialised and separated off from others. So their structure was quite mechanistic, and it relied on standardized and inflexible ways of doing things. And these businesses tended to become more technocratic and impersonal and focus themselves heavily on producer capture. This is a phrase that basically means dominating the market. And organizations and governments that had a grand plan about how things were going to be. So these organizations were often based on a need to create similarity and continuity. And they had quite absolutist values, and they were quite controlling, and they liked being predictable, and they were quite deterministic. These organisations were sometimes based on Frederick W. Taylor's thinking, which came to be known as Taylorism, about what he called scientific management. An example of this way of organising things was made famous by Henry Ford, and his methods came to be called Fordism. So what were these characteristics of Fordism and this scientific approach to arranging work and organisations? How did Fordism and Taylorism change things? And what might be the implications of these changes for the way organisations in general came to be run? Let's have a look at an example to see how work moved from being led by a craft and skilled worker approach to more of an industrialised and less skilled worker approach. As you watch the video, see if you can sense any echoes from this for the way schools are organised today, either where you live or maybe in other parts of the world. And think about what the implications of this might be for what is expected from schools today, and therefore what might be required of the ways in which they come to be managed and led.
In Britain, the Vulcan Motor Company was proud to film the way their workers assembled cars, slowly and carefully by hand. Craftsmen worked in their own way, at their own pace. The whole process took several weeks from start to finish. These handmade cars were so expensive that a wide gulf separated those who built them from those who bought them. But the days when cars were just luxuries for the rich were drawing to a close. In 1908, one man's vision would change manufacturing and create a new market. Henry Ford set out to make the simplest car ever. A car for rural America, a 20th century equivalent of the horse and buggy.
His little old Ford rambled right along, and the little old Ford rambled right along. The gas ran out in the big machine, but the darned little Ford don't need gasoline. The big limousine had to back down the hill, but the blamed little Ford is going up still. When it runs out of dope, just fill it up with soap, and the little Ford will ramble right along.
To produce the Model T cheaply, Ford knew he had to change the way cars were built. That meant changing the way his workers worked. As he reorganized his factory to turn out Model Ts, he was influenced by the efficiency expert Frederick Taylor. Taylor complained that hardly a workman can be found who doesn't devote his time to studying just how slowly he can work. And then he devoted his life to speeding them up. When Taylor was brought in, he first timed the workers with stopwatches and noted their every movement. In a famous experiment at an ironworks, he reorganized a worker named Schmidt. Previously, Schmidt had hand-carried 12 tons of pig iron a day up from a wagon. After Taylor rearranged things, the tolerant Mr. Schmidt found himself carrying 47 tons, and production had been raised 300%. Called into an office, Taylor helped the world's fastest typist type even faster. The new world record of 150 words a minute was achieved by Margaret Owen, and Taylor claimed much of the credit. At Ford's factory, Taylorism meant dividing automobile production into simple, repetitive steps. There would be no need for skilled craftsmen with years of apprenticeship. Men could learn to do any job quickly. A trained wheelwright no longer made each wheel in its entirety. Wheel making was broken down into almost 100 steps, done by different men at different machines. It was much faster, but workers could still complete only 200 cars a day. So in 1913, Ford introduced his most revolutionary change yet.
In those days, each car was built from the frame up on stationary wooden horses.
The Ford Motor Company filmed a reenactment of how Henry Ford first tried out his new idea.
Henry Ford watched it for a while, then he had an inspiration. Instead of moving the men past the cars, why not move the cars past the men? So on one hot August morning, they tried it that way. A husky young fellow put a rope over his shoulder, and Henry Ford called, "Let's go." And at that very moment, as the workmen began to fasten the parts onto the slowly moving car, the assembly line was born.
Soon assembly lines were up and running in Ford's factory. The lines became the key to mass production, a system that would remain virtually unchanged for most of the century. A network of clanging conveyors was used to deliver parts to an exact point on the line. The workers became an integral part of the great machine, and management set the pace, without discussion or negotiation, for unions were forbidden. The men faced new pressure as the final assembly line beat out the rhythm for the whole factory. There was no way they could stop or slow it down. Few stood the pace and din for long. Men tried it for a few weeks, then quit. But Ford had an answer. The company was making record profits. The time taken to build each car had dropped to 1.5 hours, so he could afford to raise pay. When he announced he was doubling wages to the unheard-of level of $5 a day, the factory was besieged with applicants. By 1920, Detroit was a boom town. Its population had quadrupled since 1900. Other car makers adopted the Ford method. Ford's recipe, mass production, low costs, high wages, was creating not only cheap cars, but well-paid workers. By the mid-1920s, Ford had built the largest factory in the world. At the River Rouge plant, coal, iron, sand, and rubber were delivered at one end, and 2,500 Model Ts a day streamed out the other. Up to 80,000 men worked there. Above all, it was the constant supply of new men arriving in Detroit that made it possible. The company set the terms. If they worked fast and obeyed orders, they got the wages. Over 70% were recent immigrants, so the company had its own language schools.
I fill the kettle with water.
It was a game for which Ford made the rules simple but strict. High pay for hard work. Ford's private security force, the Plant Protection Service, kept discipline. Anyone who recruited for the unions was fired. Company spies kept a lookout for those considered to be troublemakers. Ford stressed all the material benefits high pay could bring. Workers were encouraged to put part of their wages aside each week to save for their own car through a company-run plan.
Now, in contrast to this, modernism and its way of behaving and thinking about organisations and the nature of work and leadership and change, postmodernism organisations were more characterised by being small, with flatter management, using teamwork, and with people having multi-team membership. And they tended also to be open, with quite flexible boundaries, and employed people with multiple skills and abilities. So they were more organic, flexible, changing. And they were niche targeted. They were post-Fordist, and they were very person-centred and consumerist orientated. And they tended to have none of these meta-narratives. And they saw the world as being full of difference and discontinuity, with values that were quite relativist rather than absolute. And they encouraged self-organisation and autonomy. And they expected the society and the people and the world around them to be unpredictable and indeterminate and not fixed. So the ways in which organizations came to be led and managed changed as a result of these different ways of thinking in the postmodern age. And so did ideas about what a good leadership came to mean. And the postmodern age has also been characterized by what are sometimes called the 10 major revolutions. And these are changes in the information and knowledge that we now have available to us, the changes in populations and population redistribution and migration, the effects of globalization on local economies and countries and societies, the social relationship revolution in the way we deal and interact with each other, large-scale changes in economics with the changing powers in different parts of the world and the rise of some economies in the world, places obviously such as China. We've seen huge changes in technology and how that's changed the relationship between people and how we interact and how we run and organize businesses, societies, and schools. We've seen rising concerns about ecological issues and environmental issues. We have seen new movements in aesthetics and the arts and in politics and the changing way politics has affected the world around us. And these have all affected our values and the way we think about ourselves and our place in society and how we should interact with other people, whether that's in general social terms or whether that's inside places like schools. And the postmodern age has also given rise to what are sometimes regarded as the 10 major revolutions. The knowledge and information revolution, which has seen the rapid development and expansion of global electronic infrastructures. Sometimes people have seen this having such profound effects as it's occasionally referred to as the second great industrial revolution. The population revolution, of course, has seen the explosion in the number of people on our planet and the difficulties and consequences of that arise. The globalizing and localizing revolution, this is about the globalization of trade and its effect on countries, with more population movement and the problems that mass migration and immigration can lead to, and more movement of people individually and the consequence that this can produce. For example, we think of the SARS outbreak in 24, the Ebola outbreak in 2014, and of course the current coronavirus, COVID-19. These all lead to moral and ethical and political crises that transform many cultures, and a new world picture is being formed. And then there is the social relationships revolution, that is to say, the new roles and rights for minority groups and for women. This has led to multicultural and pluralistic societies and the challenges that this can create for those societies in terms of having to accommodate these very different ways of thinking and behaving. Then we have the economic revolution, the development of a global economy, of multinational companies, of faster economic growth has had an impact not just in the countries where this has happened, but in places far, far removed from places where it has taken place. Then we have the technological revolution that has created new possibilities and problems, including the internet, biotechnology, gene therapy. The ecological revolution is about a new meaning for life on Earth, our increased awareness about the boundaries for our development, concerns about the environment, about energy generation, global warming and pollution. The aesthetic revolution is about the artistic and creative interests that are returning to people's lives, a renewal of people's interest in their own history. And the political revolution, this is about the fundamental questions about democracy and minority rights that are being increasingly raised in many places around the world. And finally, the values revolution. A pluralistic society, or even information about a pluralistic society for those people who are not already living in one, raises many questions about societal values and creates instability and pressures for change, and may lead to more globalized social values. So, how are all these things relevant to leadership, planning and management in educational institutions? Well, they're relevant because they're all part of the social, political, economic and industrial context in which each individual lives in a society. They therefore have a profound effect on how each individual person and the structure and systems in their society interrelate, and, in our case, how individuals work and relate to each other within educational institutions. The school is the environment within which those who are tasked with leading, managing and changing schools, colleges and universities must operate. The effects and consequences and legacies of modernism and postmodernism are still very visible in the world around us and within our educational institutions. The social, political and economic landscapes where we live affect and shape what things are expected and are seen as acceptable, and what things are not expected and are less acceptable. They influence what behaviours and outcomes educational institutions are expected to foster, and therefore what is seen as a good school, as opposed to a school that is maybe not as good. These large social and international dynamics are the external forces for the educational institution and for those who work within it. They influence what society might expect of a good teacher, a good student, and a good school, and what is expected of a good educational leader. But as we have seen, this isn't a simple situation. There are many contradictions and conflicting tensions that we would need to consider before we could try to answer some of these questions. So how should educational institutions be organised and run? And are schools businesses in some sense? And if so, who are their customers? And how do we know when their outcomes are good and when they are poor? And if schools should not be run like businesses, but in some other ways, what are those ways? And how should we decide which of those ways is best? Or is there no single answer? In which case, what should we do? And how could we know whether these institutions are doing well or badly? One of the difficulties lies in the relationship between the individual and the society and its organisations and structures. So, who are schools mainly for? For example, are they for the development and empowerment of the individual so as to give them agency? That is, to enable them to be autonomous beings, agents, who can act by themselves and make plans and carry out actions, be independent, and make informed and voluntary decisions based on their own knowledge and intentions? Do schools exist for the benefit of the individual students? They are provided with education and agency. Or for the benefit of teachers, who are provided with a career and an income? Or for the benefit of parents, who are provided with children who will be happy and successful? Or for the benefit of the community, who will be provided with good neighbours and citizens? Or for the benefit of the economy, which will be provided with a skilled and knowledgeable workforce? Or are they for the wider society or state, which will be provided with a happy and successful and harmonious society? And who and what from this wide range of potentially different customers are schools mainly for? This, of course, is where the complexity lies, because the answer is all of them. And they all have priorities that may be different, and they may each seek different things at different times. This brings us clearly to the agency and structure debate. This is about changes that have happened to personal agency and social structure. Now, why is this so? Is it because postmodern society is very different to modern society, when many things seem simpler, clearer, and more predictable? And the answer is yes. In many Western societies, or those that are influenced by Western societies, the social groupings and social structures that exist are different now from what they were like in the modern times, and they are still changing, sometimes quite rapidly. The degree of individual autonomy in these societies is greater now than it was in the past. People feel much freer to assert their independence and self-expression, and wish to have their existence as an autonomous individual recognised and treated equally alongside others. They wish to be more independent and make decisions for themselves. They have, and demand, more agency. The relationship between organizations and individuals is not the same now as it was in the early 20th century in these societies, and especially in other societies that are Western or are becoming more Western. Life is more postmodern. This has affected not just the way individuals tend to see themselves, but also the way people interact with each other, the way they behave, the way they think, and what they expect of the society they live in. The relationship between the individual and organizations and society has changed. Let me give you a personal example and see if it reflects anything similar in your life. When I was a young boy, if I'd asked the grown-ups that I met a question like, "What is a family?" Or, "What religion do we believe in?" Or, "What does it mean to be British?" I'd have got very similar answers from everyone I spoke to. If I were to ask the same question of the adults I meet today, I might very easily get a different answer from almost everyone. I might even get several different answers even from each person. When I was growing up, people left school and they got a job. It was usual for those people to stay in that same job until they retired many years later. It was very unusual for people to change their job or the place they worked at. Similarly, in those days, how schools were organized and what they taught wasn't something people changed very much. Children were, after all, being prepared for life in a relatively stable and fixed set of social structures and organizations in the modern world, although there were some signs that things were starting to change. And given the powerful and rapid changes that have taken place in postmodern times in many Western or Westernized societies, all these earlier relatively unchanging things in societies have tended to dissolve, and things that were once fixed and stable have often become fluid and negotiable. So, in many of these societies, we no longer expect that things will stay the same, or that the vast majority of people, for example, will keep the same job for life. So how does educational leadership take account of all these different external forces and the rapidly changing world in which we live? How should they best bring about the changes that may be needed when educating young people for a world that is itself changing, and changing so quickly that it's actually difficult to know what kind of world we should be preparing young people for? Let's have a look at some of the features of postmodern society from the perspective of an individual, to see if we can begin to explore a little more the personal experiences that may await young people in a postmodern world. From the individual's perspective, postmodernism, which is sometimes called late capitalism, has tended to produce a social environment very different to the older, traditional, relatively fixed and stable, more village kind of environment, with its emphasis on tradition and predictability. In postmodern times, there is more of a tendency for individuals to feel that society is becoming more fragmented, with many different examples available, either in everyday life or as seen on the national and international media, of what is normal in terms of family life, or the values people hold, or their religions and social and political beliefs that they adhere to. The expectations of what society looks and feels like are becoming more complex and are changing. Individuals living in such societies can come to experience what is known as anomie, the feeling that there are no fixed and reliable social standards and therefore relatively less moral guidance for them. This is often the result of a conflict of beliefs and can lead to the breakdown of established social bonds between an individual and the community. Individuals can tend to feel that they have less of a sense of belonging, and this can lead to feelings of alienation and uncertainty, and individuals may find themselves searching for meaning and authenticity in their lives, whereas in previous times this might have been provided for them. This kind of situation can lead to a world that feels more superficial, where nothing is certain and everything seems to depend on a person's individual point of view. where many things that used to be fixed and reliable and stable have become uncertain or contested. This is the world of alternative facts, fake news, and impression management. Individuals in such a world need to be capable, therefore, of being flexible in their thinking and behaviour, able to solve problems and cope with unpredictability, with volatility and impermanence in a changing world. And this is a world in which the individual is elevated above the social, where what individuals seek is sometimes seen as more important than what society expects or seeks. And in terms of the world of work, such as in educational institutions, this can lead to great stress and burnout as teachers and their leaders try to come to terms with the uncertain, tentative, and provisional nature of society and of knowledge. It's interesting that we can see different perspectives of this situation, where there is change, where there is also danger, but where there is also opportunity or chance. What's interesting is that these three situations all share elements in common, as we see here. Theories of change and complexity remind us of the changing ways of seeing our world today. Chaos theory proposes that relatively small-scale changes in the way things begin, their initial conditions, can eventually lead to large changes in outcomes that are difficult to predict. Very similar initial conditions can produce very dissimilar outcomes. On close inspection, things that might once have seemed regular and uniform actually break down into irregularity and diversity, because effects are not always the straightforward functions of causes. This marks a change from the views of earlier thinkers and scientists such as Laplace and Newton, where the emphasis was on the rational and the deterministic, where models of reality were closed and based on mechanical ideas about the working of the world and the universe beyond it. These ways of understanding things were essentially based on the notion that everything in the world and the universe was able to be thought of as predictable and causal and universal, where we could look for stable patterns of cause and effect, and where objectivity and stability were what was needed to make sense of the world. More contemporary postmodern ideas in science that emerged around the 1960s challenged these ideas in both the scientific and social community. We saw the rise of ideas from thinkers such as Heisenberg and Einstein that included the uncertainty principle, quantum physics, and relativity. Now, these ways of thinking see the universe as largely unpredictable, where just because something works once doesn't guarantee that it will work the same ways again. So determinism is therefore replaced by indeterminism, continuity by discontinuity, where there are no grand theories anymore that can explain everything, and where long-term prediction becomes more or less impossible. Can you see the links here to the world of education that we work in? Complexity theory seeks to develop the kinds of ideas we have just been looking at into a broad set of principles that appear to govern the way things work, including organizations and educational organizations. So complexity theory is perhaps best thought of as an extension of chaos theory. For example, economic systems and models of economic systems were once seen as mechanical systems that connected together in very predictable ways, where if you adjusted certain things, particular outcomes in the economy of a country could be anticipated, possibly even predicted. But now, economic systems are seen and understood as complex and adaptive systems. In that sense, ideas about postmodernism, chaos theory, and complexity theory are quite closely related. Now, whether we accept these ideas at the level of a metaphor or at the level of practice, the message seems to be the same. Change, uncertainty, and openness are the order of the day. So change is now best understood in terms of fluidity rather than predictability. There is therefore a premium on organizations that can respond to change, live with it, cope well with it, and even lead, or at least anticipate, change when it's coming. So interacting independent elements, which may even themselves be quite complex systems, give rise to pattern behavior in the system as a whole. An order isn't something that you can predetermine and is fixed, and that the universe is creative and emergent. The universe is transformative and turbulent and difficult to understand. Now, although order tends to emerge in complex systems, it's founded on simple rules for interacting organisms, and life is holistic, if rather complicated. So the idea behind these ways of thinking is that the basic rules or the components of how systems work are quite simple, but they give rise to complexity through their interaction. These things are quite unpredictable and difficult to follow, and are the dynamics of change. So complex behaviors and complex systems don't need to have complex roots. Order seems to appear as systems strive for equilibrium, although that's difficult to achieve. And complex adaptive systems, like economies, like education systems, like organizations, are continually transforming based on prediction and experience and learning and what people decide to do. In his book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization, I think the most recent edition was 2006, Senge sought to explore some of the key features required from leaders in the postmodern world. And he identified 5 main things. The first was personal mastery. And this is about people, leaders included, continually clarifying and deepening their personal vision by focusing on what really matters to them and by living their lives according to their highest aspirations. Next, he thought it was important that people clarify their mental models, examine their deeply ingrained assumptions, starting by turning the mirror inward and thinking about our own assumptions, our own preconceptions about what we think should be done, how it should be done, and what we're trying to achieve. He also thought that we should focus on a shared vision, that leaders should help to unearth a shared picture of the future, shared by everybody in the organization. This is designed to foster genuine commitment rather than just compliance, rather than just people going along with what the leader says because they think that's the right thing to do. He also advocated the importance of team learning, but he did advise against doing this through discussion. Senge thought this often sounded far too much like percussion or concussion because it wasn't often about people genuinely sharing ideas. But it should be. It should be about genuine thinking together. And Senge thought that team learning was critical and that team learning was the fundamental unit in modern organizations. And finally, Senge identified what he called metanoia, a shift of mind. And what he meant by that was that we should learn to see ourselves not as separate from the world, but as connected to it. So seeing problems not as things created out there somewhere by other things or other people, but created by our own actions, because we are in charge of our own actions. So he argued that an organization that's characterized by continuous learning about these things, about how it should be, is one where people are continually discovering how they create their own reality and can therefore change it. In his book, Senge identified what he called the laws of the fifth discipline. These are unwritten laws that all successful organizations should take heed of if they expect to work effectively. The first one is that today's problems often come from yesterday's solutions. You may be familiar with this in an organization where things have been changed quite quickly, a solution, but it's actually created more problems in the longer run. And that in an organization, if you try and push things to happen and push against people, what will tend to happen is that the system will push back. And so behavior might in the short term may get better, but then it will tend to get worse again as the short-term effects begin to wear off because you haven't actually made a sustainable change. So easy solutions and the easy way out usually lead back in. and the cure can be worse than the disease. So sometimes going faster ends up being slower. The other thing that organisations sometimes don't take enough account of, said Senge, is that cause and effect are not closely related in time and space. Now, what he meant by that was that sometimes if you introduce a cause, you make a change in an organisation, the effect of that change doesn't necessarily appear quickly. Some things take time to happen. And sometimes small changes can bring big results. But the areas of highest leverage, where you are likely to get most result, are often the least obvious. Senge also argued that yes, you can have your cake and eat it too, but not at the same time. And that sometimes organizations tend to split things up, splinter things into smaller pieces, thinking that that will make them more efficient. The phrase he coined was that dividing an elephant in half does not produce two small elephants. So sometimes breaking things up into smaller pieces just ends up breaking them up. And the other thing he advised leaders in organizations, and indeed people who work in organizations, to bear in mind, is that the best way to get things to change is to avoid blaming people. Blame tends, said Senge, not to produce anything meaningful in terms of results. It just fosters more unhappiness. From a reading of the general literature on organizational management and leadership, we can identify a number of prominent key ideas that good leaders need to be aware of. First, that change is structural, it's systemic, and it's system disturbing. And it's a dynamic process. It takes time. It's not just one event. It's also non-linear. It tends to be messy. It's a multi-dimensional phenomenon, and it embraces lots of different perspectives. It requires investment, not just in one thing, but in structures, institutions, resources, and that includes human and material resources, and it requires the close involvement of people. It's a personal as well as an organizational matter, and that the conditions inside an organization do exert a strong effect on how successful any change is likely to be. It's also easy to change practice, and practice often changes before people's beliefs change. People sometimes take some convincing. So it's often better to think big, but start very small. Start with a small win. Show people that the ideas and practices that you're trying to put into practice do work. The other thing to bear in mind is that effective change actually has to meet real, genuine needs, not fads. And innovation and information are closely linked. People need information if they're going to change things. You can't just expect people to change things without knowing all the reasons why and understanding them thoroughly. So that an evolutionary approach to planning works better than a linear approach. Let things evolve over time. Don't be seduced into thinking that we've done this step, now we must move on to the next step quickly. The other thing that's apparent from the literature is that often people introduce policies thinking that that will automatically bring about change. But policy doesn't actually mandate what actually happens in schools and classrooms. Not really. And the critical site of change is the classroom and the teacher. The other thing is that innovation is a creative process, and it requires people to have problem-solving abilities. Change is also about learning, with schools as organisations in which learning takes place. And that doesn't mean the pupils, it means the staff and the leaders. And that effective change actually integrates top-down strategies, the grand plans, into meaningful change at the classroom and student level. Other influential writers in the field of organisational leadership and change are Harvey Robbins and Michael Finley, who produced a book called Why Change Doesn't Work. And we can summarise many of the key ideas that they had into what they called the 7 unchangeable rules of change. The first rule is that people are people, and they'll do what they think is in their best interests, and they'll be as rational as circumstances let them, but that's the way people will behave. And this is called the law of push. Now, people aren't inherently anti-change, even though change involves work, it's unsettling, it's worrying, it can be sometimes a little frightening. But most people will in fact embrace initiatives for change, providing it has some positive meaning for them. And so it's the leader and manager's job to explain why it's meaning for them to make the change. This is called the law of pull. And people thrive under creative challenge, but people don't like negative stress. Negative stress is counterproductive. People are also different. So there isn't any one wonderful, elegant solution that will solve all the breadth of the differences between people. There isn't a magic bullet. It's also important to bear in mind that people believe what they see. Actions really do speak louder than words. People do tend to believe what they see rather than what they hear. So actions do speak louder than words. And if the leadership and management have said things in the past and not made good on them, there may be a history of deception. And if that kind of atmosphere is prevalent in an organization, this multiplies suspicion. It makes it very difficult to convince people that what they're being told is what people really mean. And the sixth unchangeable rule of change is that the way to make effective long-term change is to imagine what you want to accomplish, to paint a picture of how it will look, and then inhabit that vision and get everybody else to inhabit that vision until it comes true. And the final unchangeable rule of change is that change is about having imagination. It's about thinking of how things could be and then working hard to make some of those things reality. So unless we engage the imagination of people in an organization, it's very difficult to make any meaningful or important change. In addition to chaos theory and complexity theory, at which we've already had a look, another approach to understanding how leadership in organizations, including schools, might best work or might be best understood is something called contingency theory. Contingency theory is the latest in a line of developmental ideas about understanding organizations that began with what's sometimes called classical theory. Now, classical theory, and we've mentioned it already, is where organizations are seen as rational entities. Organizational design is a science. This is where ideas like Taylorism and Fordism are at home. Classical theories assume that people are economic beings. In other words, they're motivated by money and not much else. Now, these kinds of ways of thinking gave way to what are sometimes called the human relations ways of thinking about how organizations work. And the human relations ideas say that people are actually not just economic beings motivated solely by money. People are emotional rather than economic and rational. And so organizations have to be cooperative social systems. That's how they're best understood and managed and run and led. So these kinds of organizations are composed of both formal and informal structures and rules and norms. And then we come to contingency theory. Contingency theory says something slightly different. It's different from the classical and human relations ways of looking at organizations and how leaders might want to behave in organizations. Contingency theory says that the structure and operation of any organization, whether it's a big business or a high street shop or a school, depends on contingencies, i.e. depends on its environment, its technology, its size, and things that have an immediate impact and effect on it. And finally, for today, we come to the work of Fullan. Now, Fullan draws our attention to how what we've been looking at carries warnings for those leading and working in educational institutions. The first warning is that we should beware of assumptions, the assumptions that we make about how we do things, what we do, what we're trying to achieve, how people should relate to each other, who should be involved in making decisions, any kinds of assumptions that live inside the organization. We should be careful. Second point he makes is that change will nearly always fail when it has no real impact on the culture of the school or on teaching. Many changes that are made in organisations, especially in educational organisations, don't actually directly affect the culture of the school or what happens in the classroom. So Fulham makes the point that the workplace, the classroom, is the key. This is where we should focus our attention. This is where meaningful change will happen. This is where meaningful change has to make a difference and be sustainable. He therefore goes on to make the point that current school organisation is something of an anachronism. It contains echoes of earlier ideas, modernist ideas about understanding how organisations work that really aren't appropriate anymore, and in truth have perhaps not been appropriate for quite a long time. Fullan also emphasises that empowerment is critical, and that the individuals who are involved, in this case we're talking about the teachers, must become experts in the change process. They must be involved, they must be skilled, they must be knowledgeable, they must understand what's happening, and they must be fully involved in the process of not just making the change, but of deciding what changes need to be made and how they should be made, and how we will know whether or not the change has been successful. And therefore, his final point is that the process that is used to bring about change is critical. Process matters. It makes a huge difference to whether or not any change will be sustainable or will be successful at all. In our next Monday session, we'll look at some of the models that have been proposed for leading educational institutions and explore how applicable they are to your professional life as educators.